Okay, we're recording this session. Good day again, and I hope that you're all well and keen to tackle Plato this week. He is, as you may know, one of the most important, if not the most important philosopher in Western philosophy, although he lived in the 4th century BCE and was the student of Socrates, and faithfully, presumably, or at least early in his career, recorded many of the dialogues, or perhaps dramatized many of the dialogues that he was present at and participated in, although he's not a voice in any of them. His brother is, and other friends of his are or were. But Socrates, as you know, was the sage who basically taught in the Agora, or the marketplace, and spent many, many hours with the young men of the day discussing virtually everything under the sun. And Socrates eventually was put to death by a puppet government installed by Sparta after they were supposedly victorious in a very protracted civil war, if you like, a war in any case, the Peloponnesian War, fought between Athens and Sparta. Socrates was given an opportunity by some of his friends to escape. They had bribed the guards and so forth. But Socrates actually declined that. He preferred to stay in Athens, which was the city that he loved. He believed that the laws were just, but that the men at the time who implemented them were unjust, and he preferred to die with honor rather than being a fugitive from justice. And you can read that story in one of Plato's early dialogues called the Crito, where he discusses, in fact, this whole episode. Socrates' death itself is recorded in the Apology. So Plato wrote only dialogues, for the most part, only dialogues, and really interesting ones. One could spend, obviously, an entire term studying Plato, as we do. He's one of the philosophers we teach in a separate elective. One could spend one's lifetime studying Plato, perhaps never get to the bottom of him. He's very rich. And most of the questions that we have been discussing thus far, and many that we will go on to discuss, were actually raised either implicitly or explicitly in Plato's dialogues. So it was said by Alfred North Whitehead, a great American philosopher of the last century, that the history of Western philosophy is very largely 2,000 years of footnotes to Plato. So there's very little that isn't in one way or another found in Plato. And we're going to focus, of course, on Plato's ethics, which is also inevitably going to be tied to his ontology and epistemology, but we'll touch on those matters as we need to. But we're still going to look at Plato's answers to our fundamental questions in this section, namely, what is good and what is just? What is the meaning of goodness? And what does it mean for something, or for a state in particular, or a person, to be just? And he will answer that. If you want to know the long answer, then you would have to read The Republic, which is his longest and one of his latest dialogues. It's called The Republic in English, Polity. And in The Republic, as with many of his later dialogues, we tend to think, scholars of Plato tend to think, that Plato is not now simply recording or dramatizing what Socrates said, but rather using Socrates as a mouthpiece to give voice to his own philosophical views. So there's an early Plato and a later Plato, and The Republic quite conceivably represents the voice of the later Plato. But in any case, that's fine for our purposes. We're going to get what appears to be Plato's answers to these burning questions. Okay, so that's our mission today in the plenary, to articulate Plato's theory of the good, which is quite a unique and very interesting theory. Whether at the end of the day you like Plato or don't, or agree with him or not, you're going to, I think, be willing to concede that he's a very original thinker, a very brilliant thinker in his own way, and also quite ahead of his time in certain respects. So we'll get to that very shortly. As you all know, the third philosopher in that lineage of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle is the one at whom we looked last week. And we began with Aristotle because I think he's actually a little bit simpler to digest, at least his ethics are more straightforward. We were able to find many examples of the kinds of virtues that he described and of their vices on opposite sides and how it's grounded in geometry. So we had a good look at Aristotle's ethics, at least to the highlights, and we're going to do the same with Plato this week. So you'll be able to see by the end of the week both similarities and differences. Again, Aristotle spent a good many years in Plato's academy and was his best student, not surprisingly, but then had to, in fact, found his own academy, his own university called the Lyceum, which he did because he was not named the successor. And this was because he ultimately diverged from Plato, disagreed with his teacher on some very key points, including ethical ones, as we're going to see very shortly today. And this is what philosophers do. We tend to learn as much as we can from philosophers whom we respect, and then we often diverge. We often will form our own views of things, being independent-minded, I guess, as a kind of avocation or maybe personality trait. We tend to diverge, so at the end of the day, probably no two philosophers agree on very much. But that gives you a lot of scope for choice, in determining who you want to agree with or disagree with. But I'm sure either way, you're going to find Plato to be a fascinating character, as most philosophers do. And certain aspects of his philosophy, I think, are very beautiful and very, very mystical, very poetic, and also exerted an enormous influence, not only on the subsequent history of Western philosophy. I mean, we're still studying him today for these reasons, but also he had a very major influence on Christianity, which is a component of Western civilization, one of the main strands of its DNA. So Plato had, and I'm going to show you exactly why, if not today, then during Thursday's breakout lecture, which, as you know, will also be uploaded. You're going to see why Plato influenced not only philosophy, but also quite inadvertently the Christian faith, which of course was not born until almost 400 years after him. He lived in the 4th century BCE. The work we're going to look at this morning, The Republic, was written around 375 BCE. So he obviously was, like his compatriots of that culture, a pagan, worshiping many different kinds of gods. And he had no inkling that, of course, Christianity would one day be established as a world religion. Nonetheless, we'll see, interestingly enough, that one of the key components of his metaphysics actually turns out to be very good template for one of the key components of Christianity. And we'll come to that a bit later. That's a sort of tangential issue. We're going to focus on his secular philosophy, okay? So that's our mission. And I think a good way to begin that job is, before we look at the text, I want to talk to you and show you some pictures, because I think that will make it easier for you to get a handle on what Plato is actually doing with ethics. And I want to share a screen with you to that end. We'll start with a picture, which maybe some of you have seen. Tell me whether you have. This is a very famous painting by the artist Raphael, and it's called, in English, it's called The School of Athens. Has anybody ever seen this painting? Have you seen it or heard of it before? No one? You'll very often see it hanging on the walls of philosophy departments, among other things. So let me look. There's some things in the chat room. Yes. Oh, good. I'm glad. So where did you encounter this painting then? It was quite a few yeses. Bernard identified its title correctly, The School of Athens. Where have you seen this before? Anyone want to just type in where you encountered it? I'm curious. In the articles. Okay. In another class. Good. Well, I'm glad. I mean, I'm glad it's still circulating in common knowledge. I can tell you a couple of things about the painting. And yes, you'll see it in classrooms, Hillary, humanities classes, art class. You'll see it in one in the Queen's Library. Okay. Well, you see, that is a testament to its importance. It's one of the most important paintings of the Italian Renaissance, which itself, of course, boasted so many great and immortal works of art and architecture. Nonetheless, I will tell you a little bit about this painting, and then we're going to zoom in on the center panel. This was commissioned by Pope Julius II. He's the one who also commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And it was completed around 1510 or 1511 or so. It's a fresco. And you can see it today. It's still in pretty good shape. If you ever are in Rome and have some time to go to Vatican City, it's hanging in a public gallery, the Stanza della Signatura. And there's usually quite a long line of people who want to see it, but you can file by it. No flash photography, of course. But here's the deal. Raphael, in his imagination, wanted to bring together in one great hall all the important philosophers that he was acquainted with, from primarily, but not exclusively, from Greece. And so it's his sort of model of a one-room university as opposed to a one-room schoolhouse. And what you could see in the painting is different groups of people discussing different things. So you've got groups discussing probably geometry, cosmology, ethics, physics, whatever, politics, economics. They're having these various discussions. He even painted himself, I think at the bottom right, the guy on the very bottom right in the white toga is Raphael. And artists often tried to paint themselves into these big things, and usually they were told to paint themselves out, Photoshop yourself out of there. But I think Pope Julius liked the painting so much, he let Raphael keep his figure in there. So I could talk for a long time about this painting, and I'll have to not do so. I just want to let you know that it's a model of a university of the day. So take note of the open archways and the blue sky beyond. This is, I think, a very strong statement that the university was not conceived in the Italian Renaissance, at least, as an ivory tower or a cloister. This was a big break from medieval philosophy, in which indeed people were meant to be religious in their orientation and devotional in their study, and were not meant to be interacting much with the outside world, what the theologian Augustine called the city of man. It was deemed to be an evil and sinful place, whereas a good life was deemed to be a devotional or pious preparation for the city, what he called the city of God. So this is a departure, because the open arches, to me at least, symbolize that when people went out from the university, they were taking their knowledge with them and attempting, hopefully, to benefit society. So the mission of the university was not enclosed or cloistered. Rather, it was open-ended, as the painting is open-ended. And it was meant, therefore, to educate people who would then leave, except for us professors who remain sometimes for a lifetime, but it was meant to turn out graduates who would then benefit society in various capacities. And that's naturally the model that we still use today. The two sculptors, if you're wondering who the sculptors are, they're this one is Apollo, who's the god of the arts and the god of healing, god of music. So the arts obviously have a very important place. And on the other side is Athena, who is the patron saint of virtue. So she represents virtue, and you can see already the effect that the Greek virtue ethics has had on the painter Raphael and on the age, because the Greek virtues were thought to be conducive to a good life and not at all in conflict with the theology. It was thought that one could lead a good life in the city of man as a preparation for life everlasting in the city of God. It wasn't a contradiction. So that's sort of overview, and very interesting painting. You can find online art historians' identifications of almost all the figures. If you say who's in there, you will pick up from various websites a kind of a schematic that numbers everybody and identifies most of them by name, or at least that there's a consensus on who most of them were. But anyway, we'll focus on the two central figures now, who are Plato and Aristotle. Just one more thing in passing. it happens that the original title of this painting is not the School of Athens. That's a kind of, I call it a diplomatic fudge, because there were many schools in Athens. There was in Plato's time, a philosopher on virtually every street corner, and each one of them had a school. So there were a multiplicity of schools, not one school. Plato's Republic was the most famous, but there were many schools in Greek philosophy. The original title of the painting in Latin is Causorum Cognitio, which means knowledge of causes. That's a much more important title, I think. So the idea is that the deliberations of these philosophers, remember, who were also the first scientists, and the deliberations of these philosophers, mathematicians, logicians, scientists, political scientists, all of them were trying to get at reliable knowledge of causes, including the causes of happiness, including the causes of justice, and so forth. So it was really knowledge of causes that was driving their inquiry. So you can also appreciate perhaps the mission of the university to understand the nature of cause and effect in the human world as well as the natural world. All right. Any questions or comments about that? Before we go on, I want to now zoom in on Plato and Aristotle. Okay. So far, so good, right? I'm assuming. Okay. So let's have a look now at the central panel. And this thing I will stop sharing in order to come back and share now the central panel, so we can have a very close look at the two main figures. Okay, so we've zoomed in. And here are the two central figures, who are not surprisingly the two we're studying right now. Plato, who's the older guy, with the white beard and his finger in the air, and Aristotle, who's looking at him and holding his hand out in a different direction. Now, Plato is not giving Aristotle the finger. Please note, they're pointing in not in opposite, but rather in orthogonal directions. This is extremely significant, that they are not, in fact, opposed to one another. They are actually pointing at a 90 degree angle. Yeah. So we would call that orthogonal rather than oppositional. 180 degrees would be oppositional. And what they're actually pointing to, each one of them, is the key to their respective ethics. And in the books, and obviously Raphael was a very good student of philosophy, because he shows you Aristotle's, you can see the title, Aristotle is holding a book. If you look at a higher resolution version, he's holding his ethics, the book we've just studied. He's holding that in his hand and pointing outward, as if to say to Plato, we are embodied beings, and so we must attain virtue by, remember what he called an activity of the soul. Yeah, we attain happiness rather by an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Those are the words from his ethics. So he's pointing outward to the world, saying, look, we are embodied beings, we have to act, and we need to proportion our conduct in order to be virtuous and therefore happy. Plato, on the other hand, literally on the other hand, is not opposed to this, but he's pointing 90 degrees upward from Aristotle. And he's saying we have to, in order to be virtuous, apprehend the form of the good. That whereas for Aristotle, goodness is a byproduct of practicing virtue. For Plato, goodness is a pure form, and I will today explain a bit about what that means. He's holding a book called the Timaeus, which is cosmology, which entails also his ontology and ethics. And for your information, Plato believed that the world was created, that the universe was created out of chaos by a god called the Demiurge, who literally imposed mathematical order on it. Chaos is a Greek word. It means chaos. But Plato believed that the world was chaotic until the Demiurge imposed mathematics on it as, in fact, a way of ordering it. So that's, where Aristotle learned the importance of geometry from his teacher. Okay, so Plato's pointing upward because this is where he believes that the pure forms of things reside outside of space and time in a different world than the world we inhabit as embodied beings, but in a world that is accessible to us through the mind and the great power of the human mind. So Plato, the educator, believes that the purpose of education is actually going to be to awaken us and allow our minds to apprehend the forms of things, and then we will not err, neither in our personal conduct nor in our legislation and governance, because he wants rulers to be trained in this way. So there's a great illustration of some significant difference between the two. And since one of you asked last Monday, isn't that Gnosticism? Well, David, it's the root of what later became Gnosticism. It's the idea of knowing, or at least of having the capacity to know. But just having the capacity to know is not enough. And what we need is that capacity to be awakened. And Plato saw the role of the philosopher as a kind of awakener to that capacity. So the roots of many things are in Plato, David, an incredible number of things. Ahmed, Plato supposedly means broad shoulders, and wrestling was, preoccupation and one of the original Olympic sports. So the Greeks were, of course, preoccupied with physical fitness as well as mental fitness. So it may well have been influenced by his experience in physical and athletics, but essentially Plato and Aristotle differ fundamentally on this main point, that for Aristotle, happiness is attained by exercising virtues in our conduct, and for Plato, happiness is attained by apprehending the pure form of goodness and the pure form of justice and the pure forms of these things, which are indeed residing outside of space and time. They're in a separate world of ideas which never changes and never dies. Hence, he's pointing upward as if to point to a different realm, not the physical realm at all. So although his philosophy was certainly affected by the physical culture of the time, and his three parts of the soul and his three parts of the state also reflect that, as we'll see, the main task of the philosopher is to firstly awaken himself or herself to the forms, and then to help others to, as a guide or as a midwife, that's the metaphor he used, to the birth in others. But note that for Plato, virtues are innate. For Aristotle, remember, very importantly, right? Virtues are acquired and vices are acquired. We're neither good nor bad by birth, says Aristotle. We will acquire habits, and good habits are called virtues and bad habits vices. But it is neither, remember Aristotle's words, it's neither against nature or according to nature that virtues or vices are required by us. These are things that come from habit. We are creatures of habit by nature, but nature doesn't decide which habits we'll adopt. That's up to us, and earlier in life, up to our influences. Whereas Plato has a completely different view. Plato believes that the virtues, such as justice, wisdom, temperance, those courage, those cardinal virtues, are actually innate. In other words, we are born virtuous, said Plato. We're born virtuous, but also, in some sense, ignorant of that capacity, of that innate capacity to exercise virtue and to be virtuous. So we need somehow to have that capacity mobilized or stimulated or awakened. And that's the role of education. For Plato, that's the role of education. And the philosopher's role is central. So in a dialogue called Theaetetus, Plato discusses this, and actually one of his metaphors is the philosopher as midwife. So philosophers don't give you virtue, or some did sell you virtue. The so-called sophists were accused of trying to bottle and sell that stuff, like pay this guy and you'll be virtuous. Plato disagreed with them very strongly. He said the sophists, this was Socrates talking, he said, they can't give you virtue because they don't possess it. You do. It's innate. You're born with virtue. But and Plato said we're all pregnant with virtue, but we sometimes need a midwife to assist with the birth. And the philosopher is actually a midwife to the birth of virtues in us all. That's I think, a very charming and a very beautiful metaphor. So again, it's extremely optimistic about the human being, that we're all born with the capacity to be virtuous, but require usually assistance, just as a woman would not often give birth alone, but can benefit from the assistance of a midwife. And these days, sometimes a doctor, but usually a midwife in those days was all they had. And it was good enough, obviously, or we wouldn't be here. But similarly, the philosopher is the midwife to the birth of virtue in others. And if you want to read that, it's in a very charming dialogue called the Theaetetus. That's the where you get the metaphor of the philosopher's midwife. And so for Plato, nobody's born evil either. Evil for Plato, if you're asking what good is, and I'm going to explain that very shortly, if I can, the opposite of good is going to be an ignorance of the good. It's not going to be evil. He doesn't give it equal standing with goodness. He says that people who behave badly, or people who believe, specifically people who behave unjustly, cruelly or callously, or worse, criminally, and people who do unjust things to one another, he said they're fundamentally ignorant of virtue. That's why they do this. If they were actually knowledgeable in the sense of having virtue awakened in them, they would be incapable of being unjust. Incapable. And anyone who is therefore awakened to their own inner virtue would be a good person, would be incapable of harming others or being unjust to others. So this is a very enlightened, in a certain sense, enlightened philosophy. That's right, Ahmed. People are born good, but we need help to become aware of our virtue within, that not everybody becomes aware of it. Perhaps people are exposed to malign influences. Perhaps people do not have a chance to have the right kind of education which would conduce to the birth of their own wisdom. And so they remain basically insensible to it. They never know that they have virtue inside. They're out of touch, if you like, with their virtues. And so they may be lured down different pathways. But they're not evil. They're actually ignorant of goodness. This is quite an original. I mean, we're talking about 375 BC. It is an unbelievably enlightened worldview for such an relatively early time in civilization. So that's okay. Is that clear? So now let's go to let's try and sharpen this view of what it is to be good, what goodness means. Since Plato's pointing up to the sky, it's much easier, as I said, to understand Aristotle's embodied form. But what about Plato? Because he's talking about a disembodied form. And we're going to now look at the very famous allegory of the cave that comes from Book 7 of the Republic. And I'm going to share another picture with you in order to illustrate that. I think this, if I'm not mistaken, it's a Chinese saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so I think that a picture will be much more illustrative of this very famous allegory of the cave. This is what I'm typing in, allegory. You all know what an allegory means. It's beyond a simile or a metaphor. It's like a parable. It's a story. It's much more than a metaphor. It's a story that is meant to illustrate something fairly momentous. I think that in a religious context, we might call it a parable. Parable is a story that has usually a religious moral. An allegory is a story that has very often a secular moral. So we're going to look at this parable, this allegory of the cave. And I'm just going to very quickly share the text with you just to set up Plato's premise for this. And then I'm going to go to a picture of it, which will actually, I think, depict the allegory with a verbal explanation for you. It'll be simpler. Although I'm expecting you're all going to read that extract from Plato, if you haven't already. It's in your assigned text and it's all over the place. It's one of his most important teachings. So let's go just to the introduction to that. This is from the assigned textbook, but you will find it everywhere online, Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And so the excerpt is from Book 7. And he's drawing this analogy to depict something important. What does it mean for the soul to be educated? The soul that is innately virtuous, and how is it that the soul becomes educated in its own virtues? And this analogy is crucial for understanding Plato's distinction between the world we experience through our senses and the intelligible world of these so-called forms, which for Plato means something very special. So already now you see that Plato's drawing a distinction between the world of the senses, the empirical world, the world we experience on an everyday basis through our five senses, and this other world that he's pointing upward in Raphael's painting to point toward, namely the world of forms. And the world of the senses for Plato is called the world of becoming, because everything's always changing into something else. It's an unstable world, and it's also a very misleading world. The world of perception, if you want to call it that, and the world of reality, or the world of being for Plato. The world in which the forms reside is an unchanging, permanent world, not affected by anything that happens in human life. And in fact, it's outside of space-time altogether. But it's nonetheless real for Plato, and it's a if you like, a more evolved form of reality, a higher form of reality, and only the human mind is able to apprehend it. The lower animals don't. We do. We're fortunate in our capacities as humans to be able to apprehend the world of forms. And as the text says, the world of forms is in some sense more real. It's a more fundamental level of reality. We have a saying today. How many of you are inundated with the saying, or maybe even suspicious or tired of the saying, perception is reality? Have you heard this being said? I'm just curious. Are people being told that perception is reality? Yeah. Well, Plato would say, absolutely not. There's a huge difference. For Plato, well, I'm glad you disagree. Plato would also disagree and say that what we perceive is one thing, but what is real is quite another. And there is an important distinction. But part of the educational process and part of the mission of the educational process is to help us distinguish between perception and reality. And reality is for Plato, is this unchanging world of the forms. Perception is this constantly shifting world of our not only what we perceive with the senses, but also our reactions to what we perceive and what we get caught up in and carried away with as a result of it. Okay. So Taisha also says, I disagree. Yes. I mean, I'm not telling you what to agree or disagree with. But I am suggesting that there are some very powerful philosophical arguments that can be brought to bear that would indeed support the notion that perception and reality are two very different things. Our perceptions are basically flawed and filtered and prone to all kinds of conceptual errors as well as perceptual incapacities. None of us sees the full spectrum. None of us hears the full spectrum of the auditory. I mean, our senses are very limited. And also what we sense is very distorted in some ways. That's, again, why 12 eyewitnesses will all give you a different story of what they witnessed. And this is the world of perception. It's not they didn't see what they claim to have seen, is that they filtered what they saw. Obviously, things happened in one way, not many ways, but it seems that it's very difficult for us to get past our own perceptions and to get to the bottom of things. Yeah, what's really happening as opposed to what appears to be happening. Okay, so that's Plato's main thesis, that there are these two different worlds. And what he's concerned with is, of course, to reach the world of the real. So I'm glad you've heard this phrase, and it will be something for you to contemplate in light of what Plato has to say about it. And I'm just going to tell you, you should read this for yourselves, and we'll look at the picture. But he's going to give us a very compelling and I think a very moving allegory, and I'll show you the picture in a moment. Or a picture. There are many online. If you Google the allegory of the cave, you'll pull up all kinds of illustrations. But the visible realm, namely the perceptual realm that we inhabit on Earth, where Aristotle has his arms stretched out, daily life that we experience in our embodied beings, is what Plato likens to a prison dwelling. And we're really trapped in this kind of prison of our perceptions. And the journey for Plato and we're in a cave, and I'll show you an illustration now. But the journey to understanding or apprehending the world of forms or the world of reality, which is outside the cave, is the journey of education in Plato's philosophy. So let's now look at that. And I have one of many possible illustrations that I can pull up for you to show you what that might look like in pictorial form. I'm going to share again a different picture with you now to illustrate the allegory of the cave, and I'll talk you through it, okay, as we have a look at it. So let me share that photo. And this is going to be a verbal description of what Plato, in fact, describes in words, in text, in his allegory in the Republic, okay? But here's what he's saying. He's saying that the world of ordinary perceptions, the world of the five senses, the world we all grow up with, or in rather, is actually this. We are all likened in his allegory to prisoners, and we are chained up in this cave, and all we can see is the cave wall. Not only are we shackled so that we're not able to leave, but we're chained so that we can't even turn around to realize what's behind us. So the only thing we can see are these images, these very fuzzy images, two-dimensional shadowy images that are projected on the wall. That's all we see. It's all we know. And we also hear echoes, indistinct mutterings that we can hear, but again, they're just as unclear as the images that we perceive. And we think this is reality because we don't know anything else. This is the world of perception. Behind these prisoners, there's a wall. They can't see behind it or above it, and they can't therefore see there's a fire burning. And they don't realize that these shadows on the wall are the projections of three-dimensional objects that are being held up to the firelight so as to cast the shadows. But they don't know this. Only the shadows is what they perceive. So this is Plato's picture of where most people are actually spending their lives in this allegory. We're all prisoners in this cave. I would submit to you that the only difference, if Plato could come back for a day and watch the evening news or watch TV or walk around and talk to people, the only difference Plato would say is that the cave we're all in now comes with a remote, so you can change the channel. Okay, you can get a different set of shadows. Maybe you can get 142, depending what cable network you have. You can get 142 different channels, but they're all going to be showing you shadows on the wall. None of them is real. Not one of them is telling you what reality really is. They're projecting their own objects in front of the fire, whose shadows they want you to see and mistake for reality. Okay, so if you want to call it a conspiracy theory, it's more than that. It's a philosophy, but it's the greatest. Well, Plato would say that all news is fake. Plato would not simply agree with Trump on fake news. Plato would say that whatever news channel we're watching, they're giving you a slice of the truth, but nobody's giving you the whole truth. They're feeding you the images they want you to be perceiving and internalizing. So all of it. Okay. And this is meant to be an allegory, not just for vision. It's also what we hear. Yes, it's everything. Okay. So again, we can change the channel. In the contemporary cave, you're holding a remote. Maybe you can change the channel. But in Plato's day, you couldn't do that. So that's basically his depiction of the political environment in which we all find ourselves, even if we think we're free. That's because the images that we're seeing would be images that symbolize liberty. Other people are less free, so they would see different kinds of images. So that's the world of the cave. And obviously it's not real. But what happens is that we have the capacity, says Plato, to free ourselves or to be freed. And what would happen is if you were freed, let's say this fellow here were unshackled, and here are a couple who are in fact unshackled, and they're first turning around, they're being blinded by the firelight. Of course, if you're in a dark room, and all you see are shadows illuminated by a fire. If you actually turn around and look at the fire, then initially you'd be blinded by it. It would be the brightest thing you've ever seen. So there'd be a period of acclimatization. Eventually you'd get used to it. And then you'd realize that what's being projected on the wall are just two-dimensional shadows, fuzzy things, and that these objects are really three-dimensional and in fact colored objects, right? Already you're going to see living color, not just black and white. And you're also going to see the fire and realize what you've been looking at is a very impoverished version of what's there. That's this first step. But then you're going to realize there's something beyond. You might also wonder who's manipulating these symbols, right? Well, you know who's manipulating these symbols. It's the ruling elites who show us what they want us to see and tell us what they want us to hear. And they may be in competition with one another as well. But in any case, you will then realize that there's another way to go, which is to get out of the cave. There's actually a way out of the cave. And if you get out of the cave, says Plato, you are going to be in this world that represents reality. You're going to be, in fact, in the real world of ideas. This is the allegory, right? If this is the world that most of us inhabit, particularly those of us who have not been beneficiaries of an education, but rather of a brainwashing or a political indoctrination or some other kind of indoctrination, that's exactly what it means. If you are the beneficiary of an enlightened education, then you will be emancipated from the cave and you will be able to step into this world, which Plato deems to be reality. It's the world of the forms, however. So I will need to explain a bit about that. So is Plato a conspiracy theorist, Ahmed asks. Well, this is beyond conspiracy theory. Because conspiracy theories, whether they're true or false, are always advanced in order to further yet another agenda, right? I mean, if someone's saying, that what they're telling you, what this party is telling you is a conspiracy theory, they're doing this for a reason. It's because they want to advance usually their own political agenda or their own theological agenda, whatever agenda it is. So a conspiracy theory is always pointing to one thing and saying, that's false, or that's true because I have something else to tell you, which is, false or true as the case may be, but it advances my own agenda. Beyond conspiracy theory, Plato is saying that all conspiracy theories are still going to be shadows on the cave wall. So we have to go, Plato's allegory of the cave is not therefore a conspiracy theory. It could be interpreted as that, but it's a theory beyond conspiracy theory. It wants to take us to a point where we would be able to distinguish between truth and falsehood, period, and not be taken in by anybody's version of anything, but be able to make up our own minds and really understand things as they are. Okay, and so that is what happens outside the cave in the so-called world of forms. And this is the purpose of education, and Plato's used to get us out of the cave. So what is this world of forms? Well, let me return to the allegory to try to make this clear to you. You see these objects that are, in the first place, you're only seeing the projections of them, right? But the actual objects, the urn, the horse, the wheel, the bird, if that's what it is. I mean, these are real objects, right? And outside the cave, you would see the forms, you would see the pure forms from which they're copied. Says Plato believed, and this is now where his ethics are connected to his ontology. So we have to make a very brief detour to understand something. That Plato thought that everything that we fabricate, everything, first of all, that exists on Earth in nature, whether it's planets and stars and moons, the big things, or whether it's plants and animals or indeed humans, everything that exists in nature and everything that we, moreover, fabricate, whether we're building houses or whether we're crafting objects, whatever it is that we're making as artisans or as artists, Plato believes these are all copies. They're all copies of their respective pure forms. So everything that we can make or see has a pure form. So for example, we see, let's take, so I'm going to just type this in, everything natural, whether natural, naturally occurring or man-made, however it appears, for Plato is a copy of what he calls a pure form or a perfect form, okay? A pure form or a perfect form. And that's what he means by the world of forms, okay? So for example, this is Plato's, you don't have to agree with his ontology, of course, but this is his idea. And we see, if we look around, we see a lot of species, for example, of dogs in the world. Yeah, there's all kinds of dogs, right? But what do dogs have in common? Every kind of dog, whether it's a Great Dane or a miniature poodle or anything in between, they all belong to what? All dogs belong to what? All dogs belong to, thank you, the canine family, exactly. Bingo. Okay, well, yes, beyond that, there are quadrupeds and mammals, but the actual family, not a species, the species are the different kinds of dogs, but David said correctly that they belong to a family. So all dogs share this canine family. That's their family, okay? Just as all cats share the feline family, right? All foxes share the vulpine family. All bears share the ursine family, and so forth. Now, what Plato would say is that all of these different kinds of dogs, if we're talking about canines, he would say that all these dogs actually are copies of the pure form of a dog. And that's an idea. That's not an actual dog. But all these different kinds of dogs, all this huge variety of species that we see of dogs, are all derived from the pure form of a dog. So there's a perfect dog in an ideational space outside of space and time and causality. There's a pure form of a dog, and all these dogs are copies of that form. And the same would apply to cats, or the same would apply to any group that has certain traits in common. And this is how Plato would explain, for example, let's say you're a child or you're an adult, and you see a new species of dog that you've never seen before. Like you see someone walking a dog on a leash, and you look at that animal and you say, I've never seen that before. It might be a brand new species for you, but you recognize it as a dog, do you not? You've never seen this species, but you're saying, oh yeah, that's a dog. That's some kind of dog. So Plato would say, how can you possibly know that that's a dog if you've never seen that animal before? Plato's answer is that it contains something called the essence of canonicity, that dog contains something, an ethereal quality. Yeah, it has 4 legs and it barks, but so do other animals, you know? So the thing is that dogs, says Plato, would have this essence, okay, of dogginess, if you like. And we recognize it as a dog because it has this essence, something that is sort of non-material, but it nonetheless shines through the material part of the dog, and we recognize it as the essence of canonicity, and we say that must be a dog. And similarly, we'd recognize a cat because it is exuding the essence of felinity because it belongs to the feline family. Yes, exactly right, Alejandra. So in the case of humans, we're also copies of a perfect form, not of a perfect human, but of a perfect form of a human. Yeah, perfect form of a human. And that's why Greek art was so concerned with the ideal proportions. You know, if you look at the classical Greek art and sculpture, which you can see in Athens, if you go to some of the museums, some beautiful, incredible sculptures, and you'll see that the Italian Renaissance mimicked this because they wanted to make beautiful copies, and they idealized their sculptures to make them even sometimes more beautiful than the models, be they male or female. They wanted them to represent this ideal. So that brings up an interesting question, and it also has to do not only with ethics, but with aesthetics. So Plato would say, for example, suppose you're sitting in a very comfortable chair, as opposed to a very uncomfortable chair. What makes that chair comfortable? Plato would say it's because the person who designed the chair obviously had apprehended the pure form of the chair. This furniture maker who made such a perfectly comfortable chair could not have done so unless that person apprehended the pure form of the chair, and therefore was able to imbue this copy of the pure form with the essence of comfortability. Whereas someone who made a really uncomfortable chair obviously had no idea what the pure form of a chair was like. And so that copy of the chair lacked the essence of being comfortable. And so this is why some chairs are comfortable and others are not. Similarly, of musical instruments, they would say that the maker of a really beautiful instrument, let's say it's a guitar or violin or a piano, whatever instrument it is, that person had apprehended the pure form of that instrument and was able, therefore, to imbue their copy with that kind of essence of beautiful sound. Whereas someone who hadn't apprehended the pure form would be making a much less sonorous, less beautiful copy, as we would get from a factory as opposed to a handmade instrument. So if you mass produce, almost certainly you're not going to get the same quality. And that's because the designers are interested in mass production and not interested, Plato would say, in apprehending the pure form, although mass production didn't exist in his day to the same extent as it does in ours. He would say exactly this, right? So that has to do with everything. And now to extrapolate that a little further, so if we see a beautiful painting or a beautiful sculpture and we say, wow, that's really beautiful, what is it that we're saying? Plato would say, you yourself are recognizing the essence of beauty that this thing contains. If we say it's a beautiful sculpture, it must contain the essence of beauty. And that is what you are recognizing. So this is also going to be a theory of art, but it's really secondary to his ethics. And similarly, if we say, this is a just government. What are we saying? We're saying that the rulers have apprehended the pure form of justice. And this is really important because it will follow from his ethics, that if you want to make just laws, you have to, as a lawmaker, as a legislator, you have to be able to apprehend the pure form of justice. Otherwise, it's just going to be a matter of chance. And most likely the laws that you craft as a legislator will not be just. In order to have just laws, you would have to apprehend the pure form of justice. And the closer you get to apprehending that pure form, the more that you will be able to imbue your laws with the essence, again, the essence of justice. So this is the flow for Plato. You have the pure form of whatever it happens to be. I'll just type this in. You have a pure form of something, right? And then that allows for an essence. If you, as a legislator or a craftsman or whatever it is that you're doing, if you're able to capture something of the essence of that form, it will flow into the copy. So that's the sequence in Plato's ontology. There are pure forms, and then there are essences of those forms which connect them. Yes, because remember, the forms are in an immaterial world. So Plato's a dualist, and you now see where Descartes got his rationalism from. It comes straight out of Plato. Descartes is rejecting the evidence of the senses, remember? Because Descartes is recognizing we're in the cave. So the pure forms for Plato are the reality. And how do they connect to the copies? Because the copies we make are all going to be in this material world inside space-time. So what connects the immaterial to the actual material? How can you connect, again, that problem of dualism? How can you connect pure forms to their copies when pure forms are not material and copies are material? It's this sort of mystical or magical or metaphysical thing called essence that flows from the pure form into the copy on a good day, and that's what makes it a good copy. If the copy lacks essence, if it doesn't have enough essence of the form from which it's derived, then it's not going to be a very good copy. If it has a lot of essence of that form, it will be a better copy. There's no perfect copy. Perfection is impossible, but it can contain a kind of maximum amount of essence and be a really good copy. Is this clear so far? It's very different, right? You've never heard anything. I'll warrant this would be completely original for many of you, this whole notion. Okay, you're all speechless. I'm just looking at the chat room to see whether you're taking this in. Okay, clear? Okay, Ahmed, thank you. I'm glad it's clear. And then I want to cut to the chase, because what Plato's going to tell us next is that there is one form that is the illumination of all the others. And that's just Plato. He doesn't give an argument to support it. He's just going to tell you that the most important form of all, the most important pure form of all, the one that will illuminate every other pure form, is actually the pure form of goodness. So that's Plato's theory of good in a nutshell. And we'll return to it momentarily. But meanwhile,
Yeah, he talked about happiness as well.
yes, but
Happiness, well-being.
yes, all of that, and the Greeks all were interested in that. But basically, you would need to apprehend the pure form of goodness in order to be able to be happy and free. The more you apprehended that pure form, the happier and the freer, in fact, you would be. Okay? So this guy outside the cave is free. Yeah, this is the guy. They're not talking now much about outside the cave, but what's outside the cave is the sunshine. Yes, the sunshine. And Plato is going to tell us that in the world of forms, the allegory being outside the cave is that the sun is illuminating everything outside the cave. And so the pure form of goodness, the allegory goes forward in this way, that the actual sun in this world of reality outside the cave is the pure form of goodness, and it illuminates all the other forms, So when we get outside the cave, this is what we're able to apprehend. And this will fill us with the essence of goodness and awaken in us all the virtues that are dormant, and therefore will be incapable of evil, incapable of injustice, and would essentially be happy, very happy indeed, and also able to make others happy. So it's a very cool theory, and he doesn't give any support to this assertion that the pure form of goodness is the main one and most important one, and also the hardest one to grasp. By the way, and I'll come back to the text in a moment to show you where he says that the most important one of all, but the hardest one at the end. That we need to see. We may encounter other forms. Let me give you a quick example. Suppose we're going to dwell not on the ethical, but something simpler, which would be the geometrical, right? Because that's easier to grasp. So suppose that someone's holding up a ball. Imagine this is close, but not quite, because it's a hollow ring, right? It's a ring. But suppose one of these figures is holding up a basketball or a beach ball. So you're going to see a fuzzy disc, right? That's what its projection would look like. Then you turn around and you see that it's actually a spherical object, right? Some kind of man-made spherical object. Okay, that's still in the cave. And then you're already alert to the fact that this thing is three-dimensional. Previously, you'd only seen a two-dimensional thing, correct? Now you're already more interested because you realize that the shadow and the object are two very different things. But this is the only ball you've ever seen thus far, imagining that one of these things is a ball. So now you get out of the cave. And what are you going to see when you get out of the cave? First of all, you're going to see a lot of spherical objects in the world, are we not? We're going to see planets and stars and fruit like apples, oranges. They're vaguely spherical, are they not? Rhetorical question. Tangerines, grapes. We're going to see a lot of objects in the natural world, raindrops. We're going to see many objects which are more or less approximations of the sphere, but they're none of them is perfect, correct? They're all, again, better or worse copies of the pure form of the sphere. And we can manufacture them. And we do. We manufacture every kind of ball you can imagine, whether it's a soccer ball or a basketball or a baseball or a tennis ball or a squash ball, or have I left any out? A golf ball, a beach ball, volleyball. Every kind of spherical object that we manufacture is also a copy of that pure form. But they're also not perfect, correct? They all have seams on them or stitches or a nozzle to inflate them. So they're not perfect spheres. Right? They're all copies. And even in factories, when we manufacture steel ball bearings to a very high tolerance of sphericity, such that they're going to be, perfect to within a 10,000th of an inch. If we're using ball bearings in equipment and machinery and sophisticated machines, we need those ball bearings to be almost perfect spheres, and they are relative to beach balls. But what would happen if you took a ball bearing and it would feel perfect to you, like a marble, glass marble feels perfectly spherical. Similarly, a high quality ball bearing, if you touched it, it would feel perfectly spherical. But what would it reveal if you started to look at it under higher powers of a microscope? What would you see? Small dents, exactly, David. You would see imperfections, in other words. You would see, are there pits or ruts or corrosions? So it wouldn't be a perfect sphere either. It would be as good as we could make. So this is Plato's point. Note that we cannot make a perfect copy of anything. We can copy things, we can copy pure forms, but there is no perfect copy of a pure form. Only better or worse copies of a pure form. And again, the more essence of sphericity we can imbue our copies with, the better the sphere will be. But no sphere that we can make or no sphere that we encounter in nature can be a perfect sphere. But geometry is easier. It's easier to picture this stuff. And of course, we can even write the equation, right? We can write the equation. We can represent without a great deal of difficulty the perfect form. I can't do it in the chat room because I don't have the notation for superscripts, but you know that the perfect form of a sphere is x squared, if I type it, x squared plus y squared plus z squared equals r squared, where r is the radius, yeah? Now there we even have the equation which represents it. It itself is not a sphere, but it in fact is a mathematical representation of a perfect sphere. That is actually not a perfect sphere. It's a sentence, x squared plus y squared plus z squared equals r squared, but it represents a thing, an object, which is a perfect sphere. That object exists nowhere in the real world, but it exists perfectly well in our imaginations, right? All of us can picture a perfect sphere. All of you are quite capable of realizing, oh yeah, that thing represents a perfect sphere. And all of you can in your minds, can you not? You can picture a perfect sphere, right? Of course you can. You can picture the object that that sentence describes, but we can't build it. Yeah, although thank you for the notation, okay? Much appreciated. You've got the exponential note, but that's not with centers, you know, I'm talking about a sphere that's centered at the origin, okay? That's the more general form. But basically, you can picture this object, but we cannot make it, right? Yes, we cannot make it, cannot manufacture it, and we do not find it in nature either. So this is really important. I mean, the planets are spherical, but they're obviously not perfect spheres. First of all, they're oblate spheroids. They're flattened at the pole, as ours is. Earth is flattened at the poles because of the rotational forces, and also it's got mountains and it's got valleys and oceans which are being changed by, you know, by the tides and so forth. So it's not a perfect sphere, but it's spherical without a doubt. And Plato was saying that the perfect sphere exists only in the world of ideas. But the human mind is incredible because the human mind is capable of apprehending those forms. And that's a great gift of being human, that we can apprehend the forms. So now you get the idea of why we need to get out of the cave. And I want to go back now momentarily, at least to the text with you and share that so we can see what Plato has to say about the good and the notion that the good is actually the highest form, which is where we're headed at the moment. If I can once again find it, there it is. Okay, so here we are back in the text. And he says in this section 517b, the visible realm, that means the perceptual, yeah, the world of perception, the world of the senses. The visible realm should be likened to the prison dwelling. The prisoner's chained up, right, in front of the cave wall. And the light of the fire inside it to the power of the sun. So like we're walking around in what we think is the real world, the embodied world that we inhabit, but really we're prisoners in this allegorical cave. And if you interpret the upward journey and the study of things above us, upward journey from the soul to the intelligible realm, you'll grasp what I hope to convey. And the Greek soul, again, is not the divine soul. We're talking about Plato's conception of the soul, which is different from Aristotle's. It's another difference, a more minor one than their view of virtue. Plato thought the soul had three parts, namely, and this different interpretations of those three, but basically you can think of them as the instinctive part, or the appetitive, what he called the appetitive part, the emotional part, and the rational part. So those are the three parts of the soul. And once again, for Plato, who would agree with Aristotle, if your soul is balanced, you're happy. Okay, if your souls, people who are unhappy, it's because their souls are somehow not balanced. And so the education is a journey of the soul out of the cave. And whether it's true or not, he says, God only knows. He's not even asserting dogmatically that this allegory is gospel truth. Of course, the word gospel didn't exist in his day, but it does in ours. He's not asserting this is true. He says, whether it's true or not, only God knows, but this is how I see it. He's saying, look, this is my picture, okay? You can agree or disagree. In the knowable realm, meaning the realm of the forms, the realm that the mind can apprehend, the form of the good is the last thing to be seen, and it is reached only with difficulty. So he's not saying it's easy. He's not saying as soon as you get out of the cave, you're suddenly totally enlightened or awakened. But you will see it. But it's the last thing that you will see, the last form. But it's the form that illuminates all the others. Once one has seen it, one must conclude that it is the cause of all that is correct and beautiful in anything, that it produces both light and its source in the visible realm, and that in the intelligible realm, namely the world of forms, it controls and provides truth and understanding, so that anyone who is to act sensibly in private or public must see it. So that becomes a goal. It actually becomes a goal. And the goal of education is actually to guide people out of the cave and put them in touch with these forms. Thus, for you and us, and now I'll just briefly show you how the three parts of Plato's soul correspond to the three parts of the city, and the importance, therefore, of the rulers to be in touch with the pure form of goodness and the virtues that it illuminates, such as justice, which is also, for Plato, the most difficult virtue. Easier to be courageous, easier to be wise, easier to be moderate than to be just. Thus, for you and me, the city will be governed not like the majority of cities nowadays by people who fight over shadows and struggle against one another in order to rule as if that were a great good, but by people who are awake rather than dreaming. Is that not powerful? I submit to you that this speaks to us, written 375 BC or not. This speaks to us as importantly today as it spoke to Plato when he wrote it. He wrote it in a city that had been conquered as a result of what you would call a civil war, the Peloponnesian War, and that destroyed the culture. And he saw that the people fighting were fighting over shadows, basically. Shadows on the wall is what they were fighting over. If they were really just, then they would have glimpsed the pure form of justice. They would have been outside the cave, and they could have resolved their differences by other means. So the three parts of the city for Plato, just to give you the city-state, right, or what today we call a nation-state, are going to correspond to three parts of the soul, more or less. He has the people who produce things, and they correspond to the appetitive, and this would include the farmers, people who grow food. It would include fisher people who fish. It would include artisans and craftspeople, people who manufacture things, people who make things. All the people involved in what we call the economy are basically the producers, and they're in that class of the appetitive that corresponds to the appetites in us. The other class is what he calls the auxiliaries, the emotive class sometimes, or the auxiliary class. And these are the warriors. These are the people we need to defend the city-state, because there are always people who want to conquer whatever it is you have. There's always someone who was willing to take it away from you by force if necessary. So it was taken for granted in the ancient world, as it is today, that most countries at some point or other need an army. And that corresponds to the warriors. And the rational, not surprisingly, is the rational part of the soul is what corresponds to the leadership, the rulers of the city or the nation state. And those are the ones who need to be what Plato calls philosopher kings. Those are the ones who, most importantly, have to be able to glimpse the pure form of goodness, which then illuminates the pure form of justice, so that their laws will be just. That's the key takeaway. The laws will be just only if rulers themselves have glimpsed the pure form of justice. If they have not, then they will be, as he says, like the majority of cities nowadays, and one could say virtually all of them, because we've never had a government like Plato envisioned, by people who fight over shadows and struggle against one another in order to rule as if that were a great good. Like winning the election is the best thing that could happen to them. And Plato would say they're deluded. They're fighting over shadows. Winning the election is not the most important thing. Glimpsing the pure form of goodness, therefore illuminating the virtue of justice, and therefore potentiating a rule that is just and laws that are just and the implementation that is just, that is the greatest good, not fighting over shadows. So, I mean, that is, to me, very powerful. And so Ahmed says, I like Plato. Well, I think there's a lot in Plato that one can still like. I think that he's incredible, and it's not an accident. I hope this brief exposition just of his ethics and a bit of his ontology helps to explain why Plato's influence is so unbelievably strong throughout Western philosophy. He spoke to many things, but this is a central part. And I'm glad that you find something. So I'll give you something else to like in Plato, and then I'll give you something to be horrified at. Because if you read Plato, you're going to love one page, you're going to read the Republic, and on one page you're going to say, this is amazing, beautiful, farsighted, and then you flip the page and you say, oh no, this is horrible. There's a lot to like in Plato, and there's a lot to disagree with. Something you might want to like has to do with, so what kind of rulers does he envision, right? Aristotle would say we need an aristocracy. Yeah, we need people who are brought up to be rulers because not everybody can do this. That's Aristotle's view. Plato has a very different view, and it's never been tried. Plato proposed this in the Republic. In Book 5, he talks about the guardians. Who are these rulers? He calls them guardians. That should tell you something important, because their job is not to control everything. Their job is to protect and preserve, to be guardians of something, not to be controllers of it or owners of it. His vision is that people who are trained in his academy, from those people who graduate from the academy, they will pick those most fit to govern, and they will become the guardians. And that guardian class actually has power politically, but on one major condition. They are, believe it or not, they're not allowed to own any property. Everything that is shared among them, they are given enough, obviously, to live on and to eat, but they're not allowed to own things, and their children are not allowed to own things either. And they're not even allowed to control their children. Their children are removed and brought up separately. This is all to prevent them from being tempted to be corrupt, so they may not use their political power in order to enrich themselves. That's what Plato said in 375 BC. I don't know of any government that's ever been like this, where people didn't use their power in some way to enrich themselves. But Plato imagined that that would be a just form of government. If people were governing out of a duty to govern and not out of an opportunity to become even more powerful or enrich themselves, he thought that would be better. But they'd have to see the pure form of goodness and understand the virtue of justice in order to be able to do that. And also, it may shock you or surprise you that he proposed women could be guardians too. And we're talking about a time when it was taken for granted that absolutely everything in politics was of course, male-dominated. And, oh, Mariana likes that idea. Okay, well, but you'll find this in Plato, when it could only have been shocking in 375 BC to say, oh, and by the way, if women are capable of being guardians because of their virtue being awakened in them, then of course women can be guardians. There's no problem with that. He proposed that. And that was absolutely, I mean, talking about ahead of his time. You know, we're talking about 2,500 years, practically 2,400 years ahead of his time, because women did not get the vote in the West until the 20th century, right? So Plato was quite amazing. But then again, you will find, if you flip the page, and he says, but the children of guardians, children should be taken to hilltops, he says. Children of the auxiliaries and children of the guardians, he said, they should be taken to hilltops so they can watch battles, so they can watch people killing each other, so they could get used to violence, because that was a necessary facet of life. So, I mean, we have all these parental guidance things now, right? Age-appropriate movies. We don't want to scare kids, although cartoons are incredibly violent. We don't want to show children violence, right, for other reasons. But in Plato's day, it would have been a normal thing to do. So again, Mariana says, not just women, the fact that people cared about taking. Yes, that was Plato's view, that the whole point of being a guardian, the whole point of having political power was only going to be given to people who didn't want power, people who had a sense of duty and responsibility to preserve the state. and not to enrich themselves or lord it over people or exploit people. We've never, I submit to you, there's never been in history that kind of government, and I don't know how we could possibly institute it. There are better governments and worse governments, to be sure, but I don't think it's a government that of the kind Plato's proposing has actually ever been attempted. But that's about his guardian class, and you can read this in the Republic. It's all laid out for you in very, very plain text, although the extract in your book is only about the cave. The Republic is one of his most important, if not the most important dialogue, because he lays out a lot of things. In any case, I hope we've gotten somewhere this morning. At least now you see some of the differences and major ones between Plato and Aristotle, primarily where virtue is concerned. That for Plato, it is innate and has to be awakened. And sometimes the philosopher is the midwife to that awakening. But in any case, a good education is the midwife. And then we get out of the cave and try and apprehend the pure forms. And then whatever we do in life, the better we apprehend the form of the thing we're trying to accomplish, the better we will be able to imbue our copy of whatever it is with the essence, be it a a constitution, or be it a recipe in the kitchen, or be it whatever else we're trying to do. There's always a form. Okay, can we go through excerpts of the Republic this semester? Well, we're going through it this week, Ahmed. I mean, I would love to give a course on just Plato alone, and we certainly offer this as an elective where we pick certain philosophers, who are particularly influential. But I've covered this morning what I wanted to cover with you. This is only a few pages of the Republic. It's his longest dialogue, and I hope, Ahmed and others, that you are now motivated to want to read more about him. He's a very important and very interesting philosopher. I'm sure you'll grant that. Whether you agree with him or not, he makes us think, right? And as long as he's making us think, then he's certainly doing his job. Okay, we'll have recourse to return to him perhaps. In my breakout lecture on Thursday, I'll be discussing this a little bit more in depth, and we'll go over some more specific ideas, as well as another delightful allegory called the Ring of Gyges, which perhaps your instructors will go over with you during your second lecture, your breakout lectures this week. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for your participation this morning. I see that Plato has your interest, and I guess now you appreciate why we're still reading him, at least on the ethics side. So I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you for your participation and your comments. I don't know about your classes, Junior. You have to ask your own instructors, okay? You're more than welcome, all of you. And for sure, I'll be meeting with my breakout group on Thursday, but that recording will also be uploaded to YouTube if you want to indulge yourselves as well. But please communicate with your own instructors, okay?
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah,
have a good
you're
day.
more than welcome. Whoever's speaking, you're more than welcome. Thank you for your attendance this morning. Enjoy your day. And I will look forward to seeing you next week. Next week, we tackle Thomas Hobbes, who is a completely astounding philosopher in his own right. And needless to say, he'll disagree both with Plato and Aristotle on the meaning of goodness and justice. So fasten your seatbelts for yet another philosopher who's probably going to shock you, and in whose writings you will find much probably to agree with and maybe to disagree with, okay? Oh, you love Leviathan. Well, you're not alone, Bernard. Do you mind repeat the three parts of the soul? Well, in passing, yes, the appetitive, the emotive, and the rational, okay? But you can look online, just Google that, and you'll pull up all kinds of interpretations. Okay, you're all very welcome. Good day, everyone, and I will look forward to seeing you next day. Bye for now.